I'm self-conscious about the long pauses.
Don't be, I love it.
Hello. I'll admit, I feel like something of an imposter here, an interloper, even like a bit of a spy here. Writing this paper feels a little bit like an act of subterfuge. I really feel like I belong amongst such esteemed colleagues, as I'm not a typographer per se. I'm a poser per se. Oh my God. Am I being deliberately obtuse and pretentious by including Latin in this paper? Probably. I'm trying to big myself up here. I feel perhaps like I'm looking down the wrong end of the telescope. This is not supposed to be a humble brag. The compound form, a form of self-promotion where the promoter thinks he is almost subliminally bragging about himself in the context of a humble statement or complaint. Everyone listening thinks he's a jackass. Yeah. So I came to graphic design really primarily through the written word, which I've subsequently found out through my teaching is something of an anomaly, actually. I think from a very early age, I've been characterized as literary rather than artistic since I read a lot and with great pleasure. And sometimes it seems as I think I use the word as a kind of prophylactic from experience the world maybe directly. Words seem to allow me to experience the world through a kind of secondary symbolic filter, a kind of opaque window where everything that is experienced has already passed into a process of reflection and contemplation. Yeah. It always seems strange to me that teachers, parents, casual onlookers made very clear distinctions between those pupils who wrote, who were perceived as visual and those they perceived as artistic. When I was younger, it kind of slowly dawned on me that reading grey slabs of writing and verbiage on a page, although I was quite applauded for developing this kind of critical literacy, never felt like it was really enough for me. I realized I preferred the kind of compound molecules of words when they were combined with music as lyrics, with images in pictorial magazines and television and comics, or as I latterly found out, containing an element of the visual written within them through their typographic form. So in the form of newspaper headlines, in the form of underground magazines, in the form of like terrible to kind of propaganda posters, to kind of earworms that we were kind of provided with in the 70s and 80s, to art that dealt with image and text in kind of quite subversive ways, which were drawing on those kind of media forms. So at first, as children, that interest manifests itself really in the nature of handwriting. The first clothing that our words, and I don't think probably quite so innocently wear. It's like a kind of obviously like an accent or a dialect. There is actually very little organic about our choice of handwriting. This is Louise Bourgeois' handwriting. It's a semi-conscious early design decision made through a series of predispositions, through taste, imitation, physiological or psychological determinations. Like many typographers, perhaps, I seem to care a little too much about how my writing looked rather than actually what it really meant. Where for others, really handwriting was a process of expediency, speed, effectiveness. But handwriting became, like for me, a matter of personal pride. So for me, words always had a kind of visuality. I was interested in the abstract forms of these letter forms, but my schooling, not my education, I'd make a difference between the two, emphasized and valued analysis and reflection and meaning over the seductive, and perhaps they would regard it as superficial attraction of the forms of the words themselves. I was taught to see through the shapes and not at the shapes, as Caroline Neverhaven puts it. Surrounded by words out in the streets, in magazines, and in newspapers, we were taught to aspire to a form of literacy that actually paid very little mind to the visuality or context of the words that we were enveloped within every day. These words escaped our notice. They slipped from under our perception, repeated as earworms or jingles in school playgrounds. We were not trained with a distinct vocabulary to be able to find pleasure or to deconstruct the meanings as our English language lessons. As our English literature lessons valued a different kind of leversite, and I think form of cultural snobbery. This is F.R. Leavis, who was the kind of the doyen of English literature, who had a very kind of snobbish attitude about the kind of the word. And I think I was still taught in this kind of tradition. I felt I was condescended to by my teachers because I was obsessed by the image text continuum of comic strips and underground magazines, which constituted for them a kind of lesser reading in a culture where formal literacy was valued above all else, often as a result of, I think, a British class system which understood the abstract symbolic language of the written word as a kind of gold standard entry into culture. And the kind of question is, whose culture? Which culture? And people like Raymond Williams obviously expounded on this in keywords. Whose culture and which culture was I being inducted into? So I do not see words without these rival, ameliorating, complementary, competing, subverting, contrapuntal visual forms. And for me, there is genuine complexity in the intermingling of these supposedly antagonistic semantic streams. So I am an imposter because I see typography as a wonderfully impure act, not as an arcane set of knowledges and skills and guarded by a set of scribes, which we've seen lots of images of these people already today. Scribes and monks and nuns and arts and crafts, artisans and highly skilled workers and refined artists with levels of specialist knowledge that I do not simply possess, even having taught for 21 years or whatever. I have come to value the very definition of graphic designer as a form of organic intellectual, as Gramsci called it, deeply implicated and immersed in the flow of multidisciplinary communications, theory and practice, integrated as in a form of praxis. The notion of a graphic designer as what the South American concrete poets and the grandes call a visual and a language designer, where that visual language is in a constant state of flux, a set of symbols and words and cues and icons and images and hieroglyphs and metaphors and poems whose meanings are constantly uncertain and constantly contested in our culture. Returning to the original definitions of graphic, coming from grapheme, which suggests or pertains to drawing or writing in equal measure. This is a world, I think, a long distance from that. It's a long distance from the hushed libraries of the scribe and the skills of the traditional typeset. This is not to say that I'm unaware of those wider histories and traditions of typography. One of the kind of key things I've been really struck throughout my teaching by fellow tutors whose knowledge of, say, the typesetting poetry of E. Cummins, or whose historical understanding of the use of Futura in pre-war Germany, or the evolution of accents grotesque in the 19th, 20th century, were completely eye-opening to me. But I see typography as only part of the power of that graphic communication. It is in that interaction with the visual, the kinetic, the auditory that I'm really, really interested as a lover of language, but it's a radically visual language that modernism and late modernism and post-modernism, we don't say that. I will not even begin to say the P word here. This is not a call for a kind of abandonment of rules as prepared as for. So Walter Benjamin in his book One Way Street talked about this visuality in his account of the shift in reading that was initiated by cinema and advertising. How the previous nature of horizontal reading had given way to a new emphasis on the vertical and into what he called the dictatorial perpendicular, whereby the words gained a kind of pictureness. As Gert Lovink wrote later, he says, reading has become looking and vice versa. Information has become tactile. Benjamin talks vividly about how the street, being the new hard schooling of this new form of typography, I like that phrase, hard schooling, that the modern street's heterogeneity, its democratic nature, its close links to advertising and marketing, to display and consumption, as well as close ties to protest, dissent, criminality and revolution, meant that typography would never ever attain the prelapsarian innocence of the more genteel and exclusive context, or what he called the archaic stillness of the book. So in this country, for instance, in the 19th century, successive education acts had led to a largely literate and increasingly powerful and dissenting working class who demanded newspaper headlines, so-called yellow journalism, and advertising straplines that competed for their attention. These typographic words had to speak the argot of the street. They became a new kind of demotic speech, an urban vernacular, and Benjamin understood that this presumed that new typefaces that spoke to this urban population, new forms of fashionable clothing for the words to wear in public. Benjamin, of course, was aware through his close reading of Baudelaire about the nature of display within the city and the nature of the dandyish flaneur at both once inside the city, but also on the outside in terms of both display and consumption. And so it is with a lot of these typefaces, which I think used are both part of this system, but they're also derived from older functional, more self-consciously artistic or arts and crafts kinds of traditions. Benjamin went further to advocate that writers would need to gain some control of the very means of typographic production, that in this form of picture writing, poets would be able to participate only by mastering the fields in which it is being constructed. Benjamin continues, the typewriter then will alienate the hand of the man of letters, from the pen only when the precision of typographic forms has directly entered the conception of his books. One might suppose that new systems with more variable typefaces would then be needed, and this would replace the pliancy with the hand with the intervention of the commanding fingers. This suggests that the writer writing straight into kind of compositing machines like linotype or monotype machines, or the use of typewriters like the IBM kind of Selectrix, and then obviously kind of we expand this into the kind of map and things. So Benjamin's predictions expanded exponentially over the last 30 years, where digitized and freed from the inertia of the printed page, the written word has become really fluid and really turned oral within the kind of rhythmic convulsions of digital transmission. Text is withdrawn, it's resent, it's double, links burst open, feedback loops chatter, spelling is dissolved, and it's reassembled. These forms of digital writing emphasize a kind of hyper-connectedness, a kind of vibrant plasticity or social interaction and dynamic contextuality, as Martin Ferrer Thompson wrote in this book, Where I Read Where I Am. Raising questions about the relationship between the demotic of Benjamin's 20th century city street and those of the crowded typographic avenues of digital communications. I think it's rare, even now, for writers to gain or want to control the means of typographic production. There are probably some examples, like some exceptions. Do writers really not care about the typeface or the composition of their work? Do they not really understand the subtle shifts in meaning and communication that occur through choice of typeface, of line length, of leading, of composition, layout? What Gerard Genette called the kind of paratext of their writing. I understand the degree to which specialization has occurred within the print industry, but surely digital technologies have folded these distinct specialisms together. It's not difficult to conceive that a few InDesign lessons would be quite an eye-opening and transformative experience for some would-be writers. I don't think it's a radical idea. And Aiden wrote about the physical and tactile nature of the connection with her words set up her own press in Paris. And I think these words are, she recalls, you are related bodily to a solid block of metal letters, to the weight of the trades, to the brightness of spacing, to the tempo and and temper of the machine. You live with your hands in acts of physical deftness. You pit your faculties against concrete problems. The victories are concrete, definable, touchable, a page of perfect printing. You can touch the page you wrote. The words which appeared in my head out of the airtight body, each letter has a weight. I can weigh each word again, see if it's the right one. At the end of the day, you can see your work. You can weigh it. It is done. It exists. I love this very concrete and practical understanding of the weight of her own words here. She finishes by asserting that the discipline of typesetting and printing is really good for the writer. I'm always intrigued and annoyed, probably in equal measure, whenever I see book reviews of purportedly experimental or avant-garde novels or kind of poetry collections that consciously embrace the kind of communicative or paratextual nature of unconventional typographic layout. Books, for instance, like Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, Dave Eggers' You Shall Know Our Velocity, House of Leeds by Mark Danielewski, Graham Rawls' Women's World, Douglas Coupland's J-Pod. These are often dismissed out of hand or damned by critics as being ornamental, willfully obscure, or simple distraction from the pure content, when we know that form confers meaning as much sometimes as the words themselves. Reviewing helps. Reviewing sorry. So reviewing House of Leaves, reviewer Emily Barton asked, the question for each reader is the payoff, is if the payoff makes the effort of slogging through its endless posturing worthwhile. Is this just posturing? I'm thinking here about things like J.G. Ballard, people like Tully Kupferberg's news poems, thinking about kind of George Massianis's Fluxus newspapers. Is this just posturing? So I think we as an audience are far more visually literate than these critics might take us for. Developments within literary forms have not really kept pace with, say, for example, advances within film language over the last century, where viewers increasingly encounter elliptical forms of narration, constantly switching between different tones and registers, conflation of time periods and juxtapositions of distinct forms of imagery. These have been mirrored to some degree in new writing, but rarely in the actual form that this writing takes. Many of my graphic design students do not approach graphic typography from the perspective of lovers of English, of language, or as an outgrowth of their love of English. In fact, in many ways, art education and English have been historically antithetical to each other. For instance, in the Summerson report, there was a clear distinction between the achievements of those students with A-levels who are regarded as academically gifted and art students who were sometimes, who developed rapidly through a more experiential art education. And I've often wondered whether this was a result of some confirmation bias on the part of rather romantically minded art tutors who were looking for signs of non-academic achievement for what they might even call now signs of a form of neurodivergence. Many of my students are not, as they would characterize themselves when asked, great readers of novels, poetry, of non-fiction. So I asked a few of my second year students who are presently embarking on a typography only module about their experiences as typographers. These are some examples of their work. A few students said that they cannot do typography, that they just don't get it. This makes me think of the oft-repeated, I cannot dance, which does not mean I'm physically incapable of dancing, but means I have not learned the rules yet. Another student said that they found looking at blocks of text stressful. and that it can suck the imagination from you. One student said, I like this one, that learning typographic rules was like learning from her grammar school grandma. That it felt like it belonged to another world. Another student said that rather than being the one to notice and correct typographical errors, she felt that she was always the one making those errors, and that receiving all this instruction was just too much all at once. And it didn't really click with me, she says, because I'm more used to kind of creative freedom. Another of my students talked about being introduced to typography quite early on through college, and had become more attuned to typography through simply looking at a lot of stuff. But what I really found interesting about their responses was the critical content. When I showed them some work, they made very quick judgments about line lengths and about justification. They were really, really quite passionate about these things, which I think probably I had not encountered before. This is to say, of course, that this is not to say that students don't come from a non-literary culture. They are increasingly adept at reading, scanning, browsing, processing, filtering the kind of textual and typographic input from digital media sources, but they do not come from a consciously writerly or readerly culture. And I think this does have a class dimension, and many of my students come from working class backgrounds, do not have this kind of cultural capital, or have reacted against writing and reading within the increasingly narrow curriculum promoted within secondary education. For many of the students who've not experienced their English lessons as transformative, the word can often appear quite authoritarian and bound up with notions of academic knowledge and assessment. Many first-year designers' previous college work, for instance, are so stuffed with using words to rationalize design decisions, to obfuscate and obscure the actual processes and pleasures of design, that the word can seem to tie down and concretize the enjoyment of making visual words. Educationally, the word is often used as a substitute for an embodied first-hand experience. It comes to be perceived as the only way that tutors can actually assess the learning, as much as this is implicit in what the student produces. Words become the instruments, largely, of tutors. The word benefits the bullshitter at the crit, the student with the culture and often sometimes economic capital to use words to hoodwink the tutor who is assessing their work. Educationally, we still prioritize the word above all else. No wonder sometimes our students feel so estranged from the word. Typography is a visual medium. My students are initially interested or become more invested in type as abstract form, as instilling attitude, mood, atmosphere, and all those tacit and unsayable feelings to a particular message. And they do this largely at the start through intuition, instinct, close visual reading, rather than through, say, a typeface's conventional use or its previous usage, its social or political dimensions, or its semiotic connotations. How many times have I found myself, and maybe we all have here, attempting to articulate the properties and nature of a typeface and its use through analogy, metaphor, or indeed just some invocation of vibes? We all know that. As a result, many students are often attracted to typefaces that we as experienced designers may scorn to be too loud, too fashionable, too modish, too emotive, too deterministic, when we actually favour those typefaces that are detailed, restrained, functional, considered. We have been inducted into the exclusive palace of good taste, a lot of us, through our investment in history and tradition, when of course as designers we also quite tire of this good taste and enjoy slumming it occasionally amongst more vernacular or dynamic, culturally evocative or semiotically rich typefaces and layering. Our students revel in what Beatrice Ward warned against when she talked about the delectation of the senses, something that Denise Gonzalez-Chris said, it's impossible not to be involved in the delectation of senses. I was shocked recently to discover that many of my students are not great readers of magazines either, which is often that side of a kind of non-linear or cold reading that feels more like, at times, like watching, that great preparation for a more fluid or network form of reading online. Magazine reading is still fairly exotic to my students. This is from Modernist. As a result, they have not adhered any rules. A lot of my students, I've talked about this magazine, they love this magazine. And it's like, I love the fact that they've not inhered any of the rules. They've not breathed in enough conventional forms of text to effortlessly exhale them as designers. Everything is new to them. We talk about taste a lot with this. They are not tuned into this particular culture. And it takes, I think, a real form of retraining to attend to the requirements of a more conventional typographic approach. They might read this in a set of instructions or guidelines, such as Chichol's Asymmetric Typography, within Ellen Lupton's Thinking with Type, Phil Baines and Andrew Haslam's Type of Typography, David Jury's About Face. They can watch YouTube or LinkedIn learning videos with tutors advising correct typographic layouts and conventions. They can sit in large Mac suites following the sage on the stage in front, as they are led through the niceties and details of M-dashes and N-dashes. But I found that art and design students must often learn best through being confronted with a specific problem. John Dewey said when he wrote, we only think really when we're confronted with a problem. All knowledge and skill up to that point is purely abstract, at one remove, easily forgotten, or just seen as simply arcane knowledge, or even worse, the simple recitation of a prescribed curriculum, an invisible curriculum, until the student can work through this, forming a true embodied form of learning. Theory counts for nothing here. At this time, at that place, with that specific communication problem, needs always must. This might be seen as maybe pessimistic or condescending, but I really think that our students need to work through these problems without a priori knowledge. This sometimes frustrates me and many other design tutors, but we also know that it is often best to approach any new communication problems if one knows nothing at all. As Sagmeister says, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Or Wittgenstein said, always come down from the barren heights of cleverness into the green valleys of folly. Some students seem to love the certainty of this form of rule-based learning. It seems to expunge anything relational, situational, or ambiguous from the problem in front of them. In the fluid, never-shifting landscape of graphic communications, these principles can often give a sense of correctness or of repeatable success to typographic treatment. But I've learned this is a bit of an illusion. Every solution for me is a contingent on the designer, the brief, the place, the time, the audience, the materials available. And this is also the beauty, and I think for all of us as we recognize the beauty and the difficulty of teaching this subject. It's what kept me teaching for 21 years, the constant complexity of this. I think faced with students looking for repeatable visual strategies that might finally constitute a style or an approach that's monetizable or professional, it's a difficult thing to admit, I think, after 20 years of teaching. And it's often made me doubt that I really know enough or can successfully kind of impart anything really valuable about graphic communications to my students. I know that my students will look at me sometimes for discrete and simple justifiable answers and may feel that they're being shortchanged or willfully gaslit when they pay over $9,000 tuition fees and have to engage in a Socratic dialogue in which I keep asking questions of them rather than providing answers. Do we then need to induct our students into everyday quotidian contact with these typographic traditions and conventions, to ask our typography students to learn through a form called ambient scholarship, to inculcate in them a wider love of the word and its use so it does not feel so foreign to them? David Jury, in his book About Face, said, for the typographer, the craft of writing is usually acquired separately from that of their initial specialized visual education. It seems a little perverse for typographers to perform their craft and make it type readable without ever concerning themselves formally with the nature of how words themselves communicate. Interestingly, when I ask my students to write creatively, they actually do so with real purpose and great innovation. The course I work on used to employ a novelist, Helen Crofts, who often used to contrast her creative writing students at the University of East Anglia with our graphic design students. And she used to say, oh, all your students, they're all ideas. My students are all technique. And I was always like, could we make them meet in the middle somewhere? What might be needed then, as Wittgenstein said, is to inculcate a kind of culture As if someone is brought up in that particular culture, what is required for this kind of understanding is a form of life, a set of communally shared practices together with the ability to hear and see the connections made by practitioners of this form of life. Art and design education has since the 60s always valued, I think, the students' prior knowledge and previous experiences, seeing education as a form of drawing out, rather than imposing a set of impermeable and rigorous rules onto a blank slate. So John Dewey again writes in Experience and Education that traditional education tended to ignore the importance of personal impulse and desire as moving springs within the students. What happens when the student's experience of the word then is not, if it's not a happy one, when perhaps some of the students' sense of their own self maybe even seen as a reaction to the word as academic, or their fear of getting things wrong. I think this again goes back to those debates in the 1960s from the Summerson and Coldstream reports into art education. Do we surrender our students' own creative investments for notions of rigor, technical skill, and discipline? At ground level, when the student is concerned about their work, when they do not have a clear sense of whether something is working out, I realize that I can happily resort to some learned platitudes about, say, less being more, or about simplicity, minimalism, about hierarchy and emphasis. But I wonder whether these things really help that student faced with that particular problem at that time.
Aidan, you've still gone, but you've run over like 3 minutes already.
I've got 1 minute.
Okay, no.
Thank you for.
I don't know how much you had left. So.
My answers to questions will be very short, if there are any.
Okay.
So for me, practice comes first. Goethe said, "In the beginning was the deed, and only after this are constituted theories." Marx himself said that all social life really is essentially practical. All the mysteries which lead theory towards mysticism find their really rational solution just in human practice and in the comprehension of that practice. Wittgenstein posited what he saw as the non-theoretical understanding of art and design in contrast to a theoretically based science. He wrote of the imponderable evidence of such subtleties of glance, of gesture, of tongue. I may recognize a genuine loving look, distinguish it from a pretended one, but I may be quite incapable of actually describing the difference. And it is this attending to the specific practical problems we are faced with as graphic communicators when we are designing, the subtle and contextual shifts of meaning that we cannot put into words, or we can't ascribe a theory to. That's when we're able to knock holes in this wall between practice and theory for me. As an analogy, I'm a musician who steadfastly refused to learn any kind of theory. I arrogantly refuse to be taught by any musician whose taste in music I hate. I am sure that if I'd learned theory, my relationship with practice may have been deeper, stronger than what I did actually like. That what I did learn, I would have picked up much faster if I hadn't been so blinkered as just to teach myself. But my discoveries were at least mine to make, and they meant that at least I made those things that I made were unique, often through incompetence, and that I was personally and deeply invested in what I did. And I think that I developed a better instinctive ear for music because I did not have the filter of theory to make sense of things for me. Theory can encourage rote actions, responses to the immediate problem, and promote superficial solutions to those problems. And as tutors, we know how quickly wrong things become right things. Perhaps this is finally what is at stake here. Are we going back to the notion of typography as a noble craft, trade, profession, discipline that does not welcome the new, the disorderly, the kind of messily creative? When we know that typography in its modernist form has swung repeatedly and often violently between the need to systematize, to classify, to order, to clarify against the need to resist, and to inject new cultural feelings and meanings or to deconstruct. These are not simple aesthetic cycles. They're responses to audience, to media, to writing, reading, to new technologies of production and dissemination. And it's tempting both for ourselves and our students in the face of this avalanche of new technologies of reading and writing to retreat into certainties of rules and rigor. But I think it's illusory. Where there was scarcity, rules abounded. In the new world of abundance, rules dissolve. As Max Brunsma wrote, establishing rules of the game, a temptation many cannot resist, is like writing on the foreshore. It will exist only until the next wave. Or as Sister Creator's term, new rules next week.